Hello and welcome. I am Cyril Stober. Now, one of the major planks of this administration is the fight against corruption. Well, not that preceding governments had done nothing to curb the monster, but corruption had so assumed frightening dimensions that it required a dedicated and unwavering onslaught on individuals and institutions benefiting from corrupt practices. Now, one of the anti-graft agencies is the Independent Corrupt Practices and Other Related Offences Commission, Icpc, established under an Act of Parliament in September 2000. Now, the Icpc is currently chaired by Bolaji Owasonyi, a former lecturer at Lagos State University, LASU, a professor of law at the Nigerian Institute of Advanced Legal Studies and visiting professor at University of Pretoria since 2015. He is a senior special fellow, United Nations Institute for Training and Research, and has numerous publications to his credit on corruption, money laundering, recovery, and repatriation of assets. Now, until his appointment as chairman ICPC in February 2019, Professor Owasonyi was the executive secretary, head of secretariat of the Presidential Advisory Committee Against Corruption, PACAC. Professor Owasonyi, thanks for coming on One-on-One.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now let's try to put corruption in its true context. You talk about it and most people just assume it's all about misappropriation of public funds, embezzlement of funds, and that's it. But it goes far beyond that, doesn't it?
It does indeed. Corruption includes abuse of office. It includes gratification, which may not be financial, e.g. sexual gratification. It includes perversion of justice in a way by which you take administrative decisions to benefit or favor yourself, or being inequitable in your decision-making processes in an organization. So corruption is very wide. There are many subsets of it that appear to create other angles or offenses around it. So, for example, you have bribery. People usually say bribery and corruption, but bribery itself is an offense that is separate from corruption, even though it's linked in a way. And then you have money laundering. As I've mentioned gratification, abuse of power or abuse of office, etc. So corruption is a very wide word. And ICPC Act is one of the few legislations that actually made an attempt to define the word. The UN Convention, for example, avoided trying to define the word corruption. But we know what corruption is. Indeed, when something is corrupt, we know, even if we cannot fully define or describe it, you can tell when you have experienced corruption.
Well, the ICPC is in its 20th year now, having been set up in September of the year 2000. And when I look at part of the act that sets it up, it says that the commission can cover all Nigerians in public and private sectors, and it includes even public officials who have constitutional immunity. Now, that's an interesting part. Not quite many people know about that. And the first question is really, would the ICPC, for instance, go after a public official who has constitutional immunity, in this case, a state governor or a president?
Yes, indeed. The law makes provision to investigate. You can investigate. If, for example, even the Supreme Court has ruled in one of the landmark cases that any public official that enjoys immunity, that immunity is from prosecution, not immunity from investigation. And in the case of the ICPC Act, if the allegation is, say, for example, against a president or something like that, we have powers to appoint a special investigator, okay, who will be resourced with whatever they need in order to carry out an investigation. So the notion of immunity is only with regard to prosecution while you are in office, not immunity from investigation.
Okay,
so that distinction should be made.
All right. So in that case, you find that over time there have been serious allegations against governors of some states, and let's assume that the ICPC had powers to investigate and not prosecute them since they enjoy immunity. But What about after their tenure? Has
Of course,
the ICPC been able to go beyond just that?
after tenure, and we have a few cases like that, after tenure, then cases can be filed in court. The principle behind this, of course, as you probably know, is that a prosecution against a sitting public officer that enjoys immunity, and right now it's just the governor and the deputy governor, apart from the president and the vice president, is a distraction to carrying out your duties effectively. So your being in office does not prevent investigation from going on. Okay, so the institution, the law enforcement agency can find out exactly what you have done wrong. Now, under the law, time does not run out against the state when it is a criminal matter. So even if you are in office for 10 terms, assuming the law allows you to be in office for 20 years, whenever you leave office and you are no longer subject to immunity, then you can be prosecuted. And we've seen this happen over and over again, whereby people who once enjoyed immunity become defendants in criminal cases when they leave office. So ICPC has a few cases like that too, yes.
Now let's talk about the independence of the ICPC. It suggests that no one or nobody, organization or organ superintends over the ICPC. Is that the way it is?
That's the way it is, but independence must be taken in context. We're independent totally with regard to the decision we make on our enforcement powers. So who we investigate, how we investigate the person, we're independent. What measures we take to fulfill our statutory mandate, which is the key functions of the institution. So for example, prevention, our public enlightenment and all that, doing system study review on institutions to see if there are corruption risks. We're totally independent. However, we are part of a system. We're part of a system. So for example, we cannot say we're going out to employ 1,000 people. We don't print our own money to pay them salaries. So we're subject to the public service generally. So when we want to employ, we need to evaluate how many people do we need. We're subject to the directives of some other agencies with regard to some of those measures. So like Federal Character Commission, they can look at you and say, okay, you've got to balance your spatial distribution of staff across the country like this. The Federal Civil Service Commission would have an input. The Budget Office would have an input. Okay, so when you're talking about independence, it is with regard to your enforcement powers. It's not with regard, for example, we cannot just jump now and say, okay, we need another office building, so we're going to build a 10-story office. Do you have your own money? Government has to appropriate for you. So you've got to negotiate that. If the money is not available, then you can't do it. And it does not erode your independence. Then related to independence also is the notion of funding. Because if you are underfunded, your independence can be indirectly undermined. So, and this is a basic principle that law enforcement agencies need to be well funded in order not to indirectly hamper or hinder them from doing their work. So this is what independence basically means. Other aspects of it, of course, that I should talk about is the security of tenure for myself, for the board members, and all that. So to be appointed, the president appoints us subject to the confirmation of the Senate. And to remove as well the Senate, there must be a resolution of 2/3 majority and all that. So all this helps to secure that you cannot be whimsically removed because of political interference or political differences. They tend to secure the tenure of those who are in office and to give them time to do their work and to focus on it. So this is what independence basically means.
All right. Well, what about when it comes to in terms of your prosecutorial powers, for instance? Any resort to the Justice Ministry?
Okay, we are statutorily, the Attorney General has delegated his power as the chief law officer of the country to us to prosecute. In fact, the ICPC's legislation is one of the few in the country whereby the Attorney General, because all prosecutions are supposed to be done by the Attorney General, but there are models in which the Attorney General actually cedes that power to an agency by law. Sometimes he can do it administratively, but by law, we prosecute, for example, in the name of the Attorney General, but that power is statutory. Okay, so he can't take it away. However, the Attorney General has statutory powers, as you know, to take over prosecutions. he has unquestionable statutory power to take over prosecutions.
So that's the point that is a little bit confusing to laymen like us, because the Act says that in the discharge of the duties and functions of the ICPC, if I might just quote a bit of that, it says it will not be subject to the direction or control of any other person or authority. Now, that confuses us a little bit. The Attorney General,
it's not confusing at all.
The Attorney General has powers to take over.
That's after we have instituted.
So what if you say, look, you can't take over, we're going to...
No, we can't say that. We can't say that.
Okay.
So what that section says is that we have absolute independence in deciding who we are investigating, how we conduct the investigation, and who we decide to bring to court for prosecution. Once we have filed a case in court, the Attorney General has constitutional powers to take over a case in court, not an investigation. He cannot take over an investigation. Okay? He cannot take over a case that is not a criminal case. Okay? He can take over a criminal case once it's been filed in court. That is his constitutional right. And it's unquestionable. And it does not conflict with what you have just read out. What you have just read out says that in the exercise of our functions to investigate, if we look at 3 situations, we decide we are going to prosecute Mr. Cyril Stoba and leave somebody else out. Nobody can ask us why have we decided to do that. That's up to us. That's entirely at our discretion. So, but once we've decided to prosecute Mr. Cyril Stoba, the Attorney General does not owe us an explanation once the case in court to take it over. So the two are not conflictual
which
at all.
case he may also exercise
the law says that he should only do so in the public interest. So he would have his own grounds as to why he's doing that.
Well,
so they are not conflictual at all.
Okay, right. Well, we'll talk about some more about what the law says. But lots of people just feel, well, the law sometimes,
I think the reservation that people have is that this is a power that if you live without guidelines, that it can be abused. However, the Constitution already provides guidelines to the Attorney General. It says he can only take over those powers in the public interest.
Yes, but who determines the public interest?
He can decide the public interest. Now, there are often things that he probably would know because of the position that he occupies that you will not know.
All right.
So, because of where he sits, he has more facts about certain issues than you would have. I experience this very often in my office right now.
Right.
So I have to take a decision. Why did I choose to prosecute Cyril Stoba and leave the other two? There's something before me. There's something I've seen that guides me in taking that decision. So people looking at me and say, well, this is not correct. It's unjust. It's not fair. Even you will say that and say, why me? There were 3 of us that did this. But we've taken our decision. We have our reasons for doing so and all that. So the law assumes that once you have those powers, there are basic parameters that will guide you towards taking those decisions.
All right, Professor Owasoni, let's look at the ICPC. 20 years, and the public perception does seem to be tilted to a feeling that the ICPC, in carrying out its functions, is to a large extent tepid. People would say, no, we don't see the ICPC, we don't see the kind of thing they refer to as a jackboot investigation, storming of offices and individuals' residencies and arresting people and,
Okay.
So
Because this is what the public is used to.
Yes.
The typical law enforcement agency mimics the police approach. Shoot first and then ask questions later.
Right.
The ICPC is the exact opposite. Now, the ICPC, and this is not just based on our statute, it's also based on our culture. And we're not the only typical law enforcement agency that follows that model. The ICPC Act is actually modeled around after the one in Hong Kong, a similar institution in Hong Kong. Mandate is also tripartite: enforcement, prevention, public education, and all that. Now, what the public expects to see, especially in developing countries, an attitude that has been influenced and affected by long years of military rule in many places, including Nigeria. The military, this is exactly their approach. Shoot first, ask questions later. Is the exact opposite for us. For example, we don't discuss our cases as much in the media as other law enforcement agencies will do. And one of the reasons for that is that there's a provision in the statute that says that we should not even discuss what we're investigating or dealing with until we have decided to make an arrest or take someone to court, charge someone to court. So when people expect to see your efforts, first of all, documented in the media, there are other risks associated with it, apart from risks that are linked to individual liberties. There are risks with regards to compromising the investigation. Okay? Once you splash on the pages of newspaper that this is what you're doing, if any suspect knows that we're investigating, will they be waiting for you to just come? They are going to clean up their act as much as they can. That's one reason. I've given you another reason, which is statutory. The third reason, of course, is about the culture of the institution. The first head of the agency was a retired judge of the Court of Appeal, the late Justice Mustafa Akombi. His successor is a distinguished retired judge of the Supreme Court, Justice Emmanuel Ayola. His successor, a lawyer, Mr. Ekpunta, and myself. Now you have to distinguish the approach of a judge, conservative, lawyer, look at the facts, from any other bred law enforcer, like police or somebody with a military background. It has to be different. So when you bring something before me, my professional training obliges me to look at it from all angles. And when I do so, I do not necessarily pick the approach that is most abrasive to do it. I'm looking at a different approach, what is involved, and what rights are included. That's what the law says. That's what I follow. So what the public wants is to be satiated by sensational stories on the pages of newspaper, even if after that story nothing else happens. In other words, to satisfy them, you can actually play that game and thereafter go to sleep. And they say, well, Icpc is working. Okay? So we don't follow that approach. The other point is that clearly we're the main institution that has a prevention mandate. Now, prevention is not a measure or a response to fighting corruption that wins medals. Because it's almost, I say, immeasurable. Almost immeasurable. It is actually measurable. So if I see that an institution is a corruption risk, then the law allows Icpc to give directives to that institution. Don't do this, because it disposes you to corruption. Now, they say prevention is better than cure. Now, if Nigeria, amongst many countries that are suffering from the wake of corruption, are able to prevent, we will not be where we are. It's much more expensive after the cattle has bolted or the horse has bolted from the barn for you to pursue and bring back than to prevent that from happening in the first place. So the lawmakers anticipated this as a critical measure for development, prevention. So when we take our enforcement measures, everybody reads about it. When we take prevention measures, nobody reports it. But in fact, prevention measures make a lot of impact, just as well as enforcement, because without punishment, people would also not repent from their wrongdoings. So I'm not discounting or discountenancing enforcement or punishment or prosecution and sending to jail. So I'm saying these are the factors that make people think, oh, the Icpc is a bit, but these are the reasons why we're like that.
Right, so without prejudice to all of this, you would say that the Icpc has more than justified its existence in these 20 years. That's,
more than you can imagine. More than you can imagine. I could give you examples.
Okay.
If you want. So, and I'm not trying to, I would not cite examples, for example, only under my watch.
All right.
Right from the time of the pioneer chairman, the commission successfully defended the legitimacy of a statute. And even at that time, it had a number of high-profile cases that they handled, including and involving whether you're former governors, politically exposed persons, and all that. Roll that over to his successor. He engaged very well around the prevention angle with key stakeholders that could take measures to diminish and restrain corruption from escalating. Roll that over to his successor. Icpc made inputs into the introduction of IPs, which is a major tool that government is using to find corruption digitally, GIFMIS, and even the BVN. So there were inputs from the institution along those lines. Under my watch, we have also escalated some of the activities we've had. So for example, we're doing a lot of people-oriented investigations and prevention measures, like tracking projects for which money has been released and somebody had pocketed the money and walked away. Those projects are being done in their hundreds and saving government money. We do a lot of analysis of how money is paid, to who, for what purpose, very quietly. So if we see that you got so much money and the narration that we're saying is contrary to what the appropriation was for, then we ask questions. You would not even know that we're digging until we're ready to ask you. So what did you get $1 billion for? We noticed that the billion went this way, this way, this way. It's not supposed to have gone in that direction. We take the money back. Or you have some questions to answer. So a lot of these are going on. Besides that, Icpc has engaged with the public. We have a statutory mandate to also, because corruption would only thrive as long as the people accept it. So what people don't accept, it cannot thrive in the community. Okay? So you hardly hear of corruption with community funds or community contribution. You only hear of corruption with public funds because, well, nobody takes ownership with regard to public funds. So we do a lot of engagement with the people about public enlightenment, discussing the wrongs and the ills of corruption, etc. and all that.
Now, you're credited with a lot of research work and publications, but let's look at it this way. It would seem, from the public perception, that corruption suddenly has found its way into virtually every facet of Nigerian life. Everywhere you look. Not just in the public service, in the political sphere, the judiciary, and even into anti-corruption agencies where there are allegations of all kinds. What is responsible? So would someone say, instead of reducing the rate of corruption, it would seem that corruption is escalating, or would it be that there is suddenly more awareness?
Okay. You've just hit the nail on the head. You know, as an academic and somebody who looks at this situation very closely, the media will report what the government of the day says it is focusing on. So if this government were tomorrow to say, we're going to focus on youth rights and empowerment, you'll be surprised at how much will suddenly come up about the rights of youth, the gaps, what is missing, what needs to be done. Ideas will be rolling over themselves. Every day when you open your newspaper, you read something about corruption because the government says it is focusing on corruption. Part of the role of the media is to hold the government to account. And the way to do that is to be calling attention to whatever gaps there are. Now, for me, as someone who is a role player in the sector, I can tell you that things are not the way they were before President Buhari came. I mean, we have proof. The evidence is there. We interact with public sector. I'm not saying corruption has disappeared, but I'm saying that it is not the same. In spite of the fact that you read a lot about corruption in the newspapers, the government does not make any effort to cover up any story about corruption wherever it is popping up. They allow it to come out. Now, previous government had a different disposition. So if the government wasn't fighting corruption, whereas everybody knows that corruption was endemic, a lot of the things that are coming out now were things that happened previously. That is not to say nothing is happening now, that we don't have corruption now. I admit that there is corruption now. But what I'm saying is that the level is not the same and the tolerance is not the same. Okay? The political will to deal with corruption is unquestionably there from the president. The other point, of course, is that we're in an age of free information flow with social media. Everybody is a journalist. The way you will report a story is not the way some rookie social media guy who has a Facebook, Instagram, Twitter account will report it. And this is where people say these days. In fact, most people feed the information that they have and use and propagate. It comes from these unverified sources. Now we have to deal with that. Those are new normals and things that are coming up. So clearly, when people argue and say, oh, corruption is now everywhere, it's worse than before, they need to look closely. Now, we can look at even surveys. And we can compare the CPI, Transparency International survey, and the MBS and UNODC surveys, which came out around the same period last year. The CPI, which is a perception survey by Transparency International, says corruption perception says Nigeria is worse. The MBS UNODC survey, which interviewed about 30,000 Nigerians or more, experience, says corruption has diminished very marginally. Not much, but it's gone down. Now, if between perception and reality, which one are we supposed to rely on? The UNODC MBS survey was a reality. People were interviewed and they gave their experiences in interfacing with public institutions and all that. It's not that it was radically different. We're working harder to make sure it goes down. And those who say, every day we are reading about corruption in the newspaper, in fact, it is worse now. That's your perception. You have not made any effort to say, okay, you guys, from what you are saying and investigating, what is coming out? I'll give you an example. Last year, we introduced the constituency projects tracking to track constituency projects across the country. This year, we're doing the same. Now, this year, the preliminary findings which I've received is that over 90% of the projects were done. That wasn't the experience last year. That wasn't the experience. And it's documented. We have the list of where we went to, what we found. We went out with quantity surveyors. We evaluate the project. So everything is documented with visuals. With visuals. But somebody will say, come out and say, the corruption is rising. The experience of last year pushed almost 300 or more contractors back to site because they knew that Icpc was checking. And this year, when we rolled out again, we advertised, we announced it, that we were going to be checking projects in selected sectors, of course, because we don't have the capacity to look at everything. But at least of the 722 or thereabouts that we've looked at, the evidence on the ground is that those projects have been done. We've also collated information about projects that were properly done. Many were badly done, but we also looked at those that were properly done. Now, contrary to the narrative, corruption is so bad that they just divert all the money, that's not what we have on the ground. And we have documents and visuals and recordings to prove it. So when you hear those narratives and all that, you've got to go out of your way. Sometimes what bothers me is that people who ought to know also carry and flow with Facebook news, Twitter news, and Instagram news, which is unverified, otherwise called fake news. And every day, even NTA campaigns to say we should all be wary of fake news. So even people who ought to check don't bother checking. So these are some of the challenges.
Well, I have to ask you this and say, in the fight against corruption, people say, right, desperate situations demand desperate measures. And the fight against corruption in Nigeria, people are looking out and say, is it that the law is not stringent, it's not hard enough as to prevent people? Is it the makeup? Is there really a Nigerian thing that,
let me quickly say that, for example, when corruption is systemic and endemic, you will not import the officers that will man various institutions from the moon. You take them from the society. And you should expect that they would have been tainted or affected by the systemic situation. You mentioned in your previous intervention before this one that even anti-corruption agencies, true, are afflicted, true. Judiciary is afflicted, true. Law enforcement is afflicted, true. The public service, the private sector, true. But if you did not get the people who will man NTA from the moon, you should expect that the same default and risks that you see elsewhere is likely here. So let's settle that. What you then have to do with it, and that's why with the level of political will and the determination of the government and the existing legal framework, you can begin to say we are going to deal with this issue. And we're dealing with the issue. So I don't think that finger pointing is helpful. I mean, certainly the people in the police or in the judiciary or in law enforcement or even the companies, the best of them, they didn't drop from the moon. You cannot do grand corruption in Nigeria without the collusion of the private sector. It's not possible. It's not possible. So people who are supposedly in another sector of the economy that is trying to maintain an ideological virginity, okay, they are as culpable as those who are in the public sector. However, I admit that corruption within the public sector has a multiplier effect on everything, because the public sector retains the coercive powers of state.
All right.
It is the public sector that administers the state. If they decide we're going to enforce the law very well in all ramifications without batting an eyelid, things will change and it will have an impact across, so I admit. And that's why at ICPC we focus a lot more at the public sector, even though the law gives us a broad landscape. Now, to go back quickly to what you raised, are the laws good? More than good enough. There are gaps here and there, yes. But I think that if we succeed in effectively applying the laws as they are at the moment, there will be changes. So there are areas in which obviously we need legal reform, with whistleblower protection, with witness protection, with asset management. All these are in the public domain, with special crimes courts to improve things. We got a good mileage with the Administration of Criminal Justice Act. So until you start trying a legal framework, you cannot tell what are the gaps within it. When you start using it, you see, okay, this is not good here, this is not good here, we need to improve this. So it's a constant thing of evaluation and trying to reinvent. But the laws as they are not bad.
All right, speaking of which, we come to the question of assets recovery. And you have also done publications on assets recovery and various aspects of the law. And one thing people have always been wary about is the question of plea bargains. Okay? And you find people would say, look, it's a lot easier and cheaper for the state to just get back some of the loot than to spend millions to prosecuting. But again, others would say, look, a man who gives off something probably has 10 times that amount hidden away.
Okay, let me start by saying that before the president came on board, the advent of this administration in 2015, asset recovery was not even being used as an enforcement measure. One of the things, my assignment, and the very first one in PACAC, when I was the executive secretary, was to coordinate the development of an asset recovery strategy for the government. And that's what is still being used till today. The second thing I did as a follow-up to that strategy was to look at the legal landscape about other methods we could use to recover assets without going through the long, tortuous, painful route of full prosecution. So we came up with a strategy for non-conviction based recoveries. It's being used today, and there are documents to prove this. Now, the third point is that asset recovery is actually an enforcement measure. One of the reasons that corruption happens is that somebody has a dream of living a life of luxury happily ever after. So when you're in public office, you steal enough money to have a house by the beach, maybe in Banana Island or in the Bahamas, have your own private jet with your family, just live a life of luxury. Now, sometimes you are so smart that we cannot prove exactly how you stole the money. But also, you cannot prove that this is your money. Because if you worked in public office and your salary is public knowledge, unless you tell us that the angels delivered the money in the middle of the night, you probably can't lay claim to it. So the sensible thing is to give it up. You can't resist. So by taking it away from you, that's a major enforcement measure. And usually when this happens to people, the first thing that happens to them is they fall sick. And I'm not saying that as a joke. They actually really fall ill because the dream of that life of luxury disappears. Now, the second thing that people don't know, and I'm going to talk about plea bargain and whether or not it is right. The second thing that people don't know is that international best practice and under the UN Convention Against Corruption, asset recovery is actually a major, it's covered in chapter 5 of the convention, is a major component of fighting corruption. Because with technology and new methods of committing wrong, it's becoming more and more difficult, okay, to get the kind of evidence. Don't forget that our criminal justice system demands proof beyond reasonable doubt. Once there's an iota of doubt, the court can say, sorry, you've not proved this case. Even if the whole world says, this man, you are wrong, you are guilty. If the court says he's not guilty, he's not guilty. But one thing you are able to do, if the man cannot prove the source of the wealth, the ball is in his court. To say, my father left me a legacy. I went to do some juju, somewhere or whatever people believe in order to prove and exonerate yourself. Now that takes me to plea bargain. First of all, plea bargain is legal. It's a part of the law. It's in our law. It's in the law. It's very well covered now under the Administration of Criminal Justice Act. You can plea bargain. Now, prosecution is very expensive and time consuming. One person commits a crime, say money laundering. He knows that it can be found out. He channels the funds into different vehicles within and outside the country. The country has already been weakened financially. It's broke because those who are given responsibility help themselves rather than helping the country. So the capacity of the state to even investigate is already impaired. Your investigation demands that you travel to all the places where the money has traveled to. So if the money was moved to Cayman Islands, you probably have to go there. If there's money in Switzerland, you have to go there. In England, you have to go there. Or somebody has to check for you. If you can't go there, you retain somebody there to look. Now, you have to ask yourself, how wise is it to use this good money and you are not very sure of what you are going to get back? There are countries who have laws. If laundered funds end up in their jurisdiction, even though they will not argue with you that that money belongs to Nigeria, you can't get it back. That's their law. It is proceed of crime. It is entered their jurisdiction. It's like you waking up in the morning and you find a strange car parked in your compound. The owner of the car cannot just walk in and drive it out. You are in charge of that compound. You've locked the gate. So they have to knock first. If you like, you open. If you like, you don't open. If you open, you ask them, you say, that's my car. You say, your car, what's your car doing in my house? Please don't waste my time. You drive the fellow away. That's the way asset recovery plays out. Now, it's very expensive. And many times, the fellow who stole the money, if he does not tell you where he has spread the money to, you have to spend time, good time, put operatives to try and unpack it. It's not a one-day thing. That's why people accuse law enforcement agencies, they are slow. But investigation is very painstaking. Certain officials of Nigeria, origin and stock, who escaped abroad, were arrested there and have been investigated. 4 or 5 years down the line, they've not been arraigned in court.
Right.
Do you get my point? So I think the public needs to understand that investigation, for it to stand up in court, okay, is painstaking. Final point. So when we plea bargain, it is sensible to do so. What is important is to plea bargain in the public interest. Right. You must, and the conditions often are that you must tell us what you've done wrong. Recently, we arrested one young man who had been stealing money from under the nose of his bosses, and he did not see it. Very smart technologically. We arrested him and said, tell us what you were doing. He spent some time with us, showing us exactly what he was doing. When we told his bosses, you've been losing money. So far, you've lost 220 million. He said, it's not possible. The head of the place came to our office. It's not possible. We do this, we do this. They did not even know the money had moved. The boy showed us what he did. Now, the point I'm making is that plea bargain is legal. Every country in the world uses plea bargain, okay, because it saves the time of prosecution and you can get a lesser sentence instead of a big one. And of course, in addition to forfeiting all that you have stolen. So the public needs to, and I think it's the cynicism that has dogged law enforcement over the years that makes people say, oh, plea bargain is a trade-off, asset recovery is a trade-off.
Well, speaking of cynicism, would like to ask, what is the capacity of the Icpc to prosecute cases, investigate thoroughly, prosecute? Because you find people say, oh well, investigations don't go far enough, and therefore the prosecutions can't stand in court and people just walk free.
Okay, so there are many factors that are involved. I do admit weakness in investigation. I admit the existence of weaknesses even in prosecution. But it is not in every case that in every situation where a case is lost is because of poor investigation or poor prosecution. We've just admitted about a weak judicial system as well. So that has to be taken into account. Apart from that, we're in a very dysfunctional society whereby as Cyril Stoba, a prosecutor and investigator, you start doing your work. People will start giving you all manner of calls all over the place. Oh, you made a mistake. And they will use all manner of reasons to appeal to you, even when they don't make. I'm not saying But that itself is pressure. That itself is pressure that can undermine the quality of the outcome of the investigation. And you get calls from all manner of notable people. If it's not religious, it's ethnic, it's political. The only thing they are not saying is that they are not saying he didn't commit the crime, because you can see that the guy committed the crime. Okay, but they are telling you, oh, what can you do to help him and all that. And sometimes you have to ask them, what do you think I should do to help him, sir? This is a crime against the state. What do you think I should do? You tell me what you think I should do to help him. Now, the weight and the sheer burden of this pressure, okay, can also impact the outcome. But this is not to say that there are no weaknesses in investigating capacity or prosecuting capacity. Since I came in at Icpc, for example, we've tried to boost these two areas, both for investigation and prosecution, very, very radically, including introducing technology and forensic capacity to help what needs to be done to be done. There are other areas that lead to this. It is the day you enter the court that you know. When you get out, you don't know. Now, the delay wearies some people. Now, when somebody has stolen enough money and you haven't succeeded in recovering a substantial part of it, or they are still able to hide through collaborators, they get all manner of lawyers. And the law says they are presumed innocent until they are proven guilty. So you are in court for 10, 20 years and nobody is saying, this doesn't make sense. This is why impunity is rising. So there's the angle for the law. There's been some improvement, but we're not where we ought to be. So when fingers point at law enforcement agencies, I think that those who are making those observations should look more broadly at the entire system, okay? Right. The entire ecosystem, the judicial, the defense, and all that. That in doing your work, would you allow... Nigeria has successfully challenged the P&ID case in England. Look at how quickly the case moved. In terms of timing, within a short time, we've got the kind of relief we requested for. Now, in our own civil justice or criminal justice system, it's different. People would raise all manner of roadblocks which are accepted or tolerated by some, not all. Accepted or tolerated by some. Now, it's very difficult. If the law says the guy is innocent until proven guilty, it's difficult for you to just blame only the law enforcement agency. In the interim, the fellow you are prosecuting contests elections and he wins. And he begins to represent you or represent somebody. Or
probably someone gets into office with or constitutional immunity.
So those are some of the challenges that we find. So some of the things we've said is that political parties should not even field candidates who have cases on their neck. Right. Now, but they will argue with you and say, oh, they are politically motivated, it's my enemies and my opponents. So, but we must have a consensus around these issues for things to move forward.
All right, Mr. Chairman, the law also gives the ICPC powers to review and enforce corrections of, corruption-prone institutions. Have you been able to carry that function?
Oh, yes, a lot. It's called system study review and corruption risk assessment. We can look at any institution. There are certain practices, best practices that institutions must carry out. If they don't observe them, you know this is an accident waiting to happen. So when we go in, we look at the governance structure, we look at the financial management culture, especially your procurement processes and stuff like that. We look at whether or not they have internal whistleblower and corruption risk evaluation capacity internally. You look at what are their stakeholders, the people who interact with them, what are they saying? So we look at their board and management structure. By the time you evaluate, you can tell whether or not an institution is an accident waiting to happen or not. This is one of our prevention mandates, and we do quite a bit of it. Right now, we focus, as I said earlier on, we have been intensely focusing on education, health, agriculture, power, and works and housing and all that. Because these are areas that impact the people. And we're also looking at the systems and processes for constituency project delivery as well.
Okay, so in terms of that, quickly, I'm reading one of your reports. I came across one such institution. I may not mention the name of the institution here, and you found serious gaps and made recommendations. Now, what happens when you do find certain organs with corruption-prone structures. What happens when you tell them what to do and they do not?
Okay. It's a combination, for example. Usually when you see some of those things, you also find things that have been wrongfully done, which you can prosecute. You can fully, and oftentimes when we do this risk assessment, you find something you are not looking for. That's a different issue. That's a matter for investigation. Now, if we tell you what to do and you don't do it, the law allows us to prosecute you for failure to
So in this case, the chief executive of the organization.
Yes. But most often, they take corrective measures. Because what we do is that when we find out what we find out, we will then give you a chance to respond. So for example, I say, why is your jotter white and not blue, according to the government regulations? Why is your pen blue and not red, according to government regulations? You may have an answer. So we'll give you a chance to come back. If that answer does not add up on the face of it and all that, we'll then tell you, you got to change that. And we'll give you some latitude to change it. And then we come back and take a look at what you've done. And this usually yields some positive responses.
Right. Two quick issues before we round off here. There are other anti-corruption agencies, and how do you collaborate and how do you ensure that you do not cross lines? Or if one agency takes up an issue, is that it? And what if it doesn't go far enough and you can see a few things that they can't see?
Okay.
Yeah.
There is collaboration, that's for starters. Number two is that the way our laws are drafted, there is also overlap. So what Icpc can do, EFCC can do, the police can do, DSS probably can do, the Ministry of Justice also can prosecute. That's number one. And it's a function of the way laws are drafted, which is best practice. Usually, if you are investigating a case and you find wrongdoing, and the wrongdoing cannot be prosecuted, the offense committed is not described in your own statute. Our law, for example, allows us to prosecute with EFCC Act and vice versa. Okay? So this is one of the reasons why it appears as if, EFCC and Icpc are investigating the same thing. That's one reason, apart from the issue of collaboration, which I mentioned. The second reason is that sometimes people who do petitions, when the investigation was provoked by a petition, without telling you, sometimes they just write to everybody. You write a petition to Siri Stoba, to Bolaji Owasonye, to Mrs. X, and Mr. Y. Now, since it falls within your mandate, you just start working without saying, have you received something like this? Did you receive something like this? Especially if the allegation falls within your statute. Sometimes you've moved a little bit far and you suddenly realize that the same thing is being investigated by another agency. What we do is we cede to each other. Okay. So whoever has gone the furthest, sometimes we exchange files, mostly with the EFCC. They'll send us things, we send things to them. Or the police. We do a lot of that with the police as well. Sometimes the police are already on it. Or the allegation, you report a police officer to me that he has done something wrong. Within the administrative structure of the police, they can deal with it. I can send it to the Inspector General and say, whatever decision you've done, it doesn't stop me from investigating, but let me know. The reason for doing that is you want to stop using the same public funds for investigating same case.
Okay. Quickly, this one, speaking of petitions, is that the only way you get to look into any situation? No. Can the Icpc itself take a look and say, look,
a lot of our system study review and analysis of things are entirely driven by us. Right. And quite a number of the portfolio of what we do is by intelligence. But we do get a lot of petitions as well.
Right. I really wish we could go. There's so many issues here we would have loved to take up with you. But finally, where do you see the Icpc in the coming years? 20 years now? In the coming years, where do you see the Icpc?
I see the Icpc stronger, and I see it adding more value to the system, helping to strengthen public sector governance and to diminish corruption, especially grant corruption within the public sector. I also see the Icpc contributing to reducing retail corruption in the society, basically working and collaborating with others. So I see it fulfilling its mandate and the dream of the founding fathers.
Well, as a professor of law, I should ask you this, and it's hampered a lot of the investigations and prosecutions for corruption cases. You're presumed innocent until proven guilty. Would you rather change that
No, I would
and
not.
say, look, we see you and you have to. There are some jurisdictions that say
I would not.
you have to prove that you did
I
not
was just
steal.
going to modify it. I
Yes.
would not. However, I would say that in certain circumstances,
Right.
the burden should shift. So if, for example, I say to you clearly that Mr. Cyril Stoba, there is no way you can afford a private jet. This jet is registered in your name or in the name of your company or somebody associated with you. It's not rocket science. You should be able to say, this is how I got the money. You can't tell me to go and prove it. Because you are the only person who has that information is yourself.
But the law presumes I'm innocent.
Yes, that's
until you can prove.
that's because it's an adversarial system.
Right.
He who alleges must prove.
Okay.
But we need to change that when it comes to corruption and some other crimes, especially illicit enrichment. It's critical.
Well, Professor Bolaji Owasonwi, Chairman ICPC, it's been interesting talking to you.
Thank you very much.
We hope you'll come again. There's so many issues we'll still want to take you up on. Thank you for coming on One.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Right. And that's our program today. We thank you for watching. Next week, we'll be back with One on One. I'm Cyril Stoba. Stay safe.